Oh, hello. I didn't see you there. Step into my humble home and take a seat by the fire. Today, I will tell you a story, and it's one of my favorites. It's a story about the Nota Emilianense. It's a story about a small skirmish in the Pyrenees that took place in the 8th century. It's a story about nationalism and a story about how an event is transformed into a legend. This small skirmish, generally known as the Battle of Ronchambeau, and it left a huge mark on the collective memory of the Middle Ages. It's central to the plot of the most famous of the old French epics, the Song of Roland, about which we will talk more in a minute. The Latin adaptation of the Roland, the so-called Pseudo-Turpin, is among the most copied manuscripts of the Middle Ages. And even 19th century Brazilian rebels, as well as Sicilian mafiosi, referred back to the legend of Roland. The Battle of Ronchambeau is first described by Charlemagne's biographer, Einhard. Here is what he said. I won't read all of it, but it is important to remember that he describes a small skirmish with Basque troops, and he mentions 3 people by name. Egihard, the overseer of the king's table, Anselm, the count of the palace, and Roland, the lord of the Breton march. There is little in this short entry that reminds us of the drama and the tragedy of the Song of Roland. Let me give you a brief summary. Charlemagne has conquered all the castles and cities in Spain except for Saragossa. You can see the famous first words here in the Old French original. The Saracen king Marsil is desperate for peace, and Charles too is weary of war after 7 years of fighting. He proposes to send an envoy to the Saracen king. Roland suggests that his stepfather Ganelon should lead the embassy. Ganelon feels betrayed, he fears for his life, and swears revenge. Finally, he goes to the Saracen king and proposes a treacherous deal. The Saracens should only pretend to make peace, send tribute, and instead, when the Franks feel safe, they should attack the vanguard and kill the best soldiers. Ganelon will make sure that Roland will be among them, so he can get his revenge. Everything works as planned. When the Franks see the Saracen army approaching, Olivier, Roland's loyal companion, tries to convince him to call for help, to blow his horn, but Roland refuses. And this little back and forth between the 2 companions is one of the key components of the epic. It's the struggle between the 2 pillars of chivalry, between prowess and wisdom, between Roland not wanting to call for help because it would be cowardly, and Olivier realizing the hopelessness of the situation. The battle commences. The Franks fight bravely, killing Saracens left and right, but the enemies are just too numerous. Finally, when the situation is most dire, Roland blows his horn. Charlemagne, already on his way back to France, hears Roland's call for help. He immediately turns back, but he arrives too late. Roland and Olivier are ultimately overwhelmed by the sheer numbers of enemies. Roland dies on the battlefield, and in a dramatic scene, his soul is carried into heaven by the Archangel Gabriel. Charlemagne swears revenge. It comes to a final showdown between the French and the Saracens, who are aided by the king of Babylon, Baligant, who had come from across the sea to help them. In the end, Charlemagne's forces prevail, and they sack the city of Saragossa. Back in France, the traitor Ganelon is put on trial, but the nobles can't quite decide if he's guilty or not. Was it treason, or did Ganelon rightly revenge the wrongs done to him by Roland? In the end, a duel has to decide, and God intervenes on the side of Roland, and Ganelon and his entire lineage are executed. Of course, I'm butchering the story of the Epic of Roland here with my short summary, but I think I made it clear just how much the plot has changed from the little account in Einhard's biography that we saw before. So, what happened? Well, historians have asked themselves this very question over the last 200 years or so. Soon after the discovery, or the rediscovery, of the Oxford Roland, at the beginning of the 19th century, it became a pawn in the hands of nationalists. The Roland filled a vacuum in the literary history of France. It was the French Iliad. Without a great national epic, the French could have never matched the classical tradition. Some were even seeing the dawn of the French nation on the battlefields of Roncevaux. The French historian Léon Gautier emphasized for every German reading his 1872 edition of the Roland just how great the French patriotism was already in the early Middle Ages. This was of course only 1 year after German troops had sieged Paris in the War of 1870-1871, which ended in a crushing defeat for the French and of the German unification. But historians were not only interested in the origin of the French nation, but also in the origin of the epic songs themselves. There were two schools at the time. Some thought that they were the product of a spirit of the nation, of a Volksseele, composed shortly after the events and transmitted over centuries in popular knowledge. On the other hand, there were those that saw the songs composed in the 12th century by a single master poet to attract pilgrims to Santiago de Compostela. One of their main arguments was that we have no record of the legend before the 12th century whatsoever. And here the Nota Emilianense comes in. It's a glossary, meaning a little note on the marginalia of a manuscript. It is found in the Codex Emilianense 39, named after the Spanish monastery San Millán de la Cogolla in what was then the Kingdom of Navarra. It is now stored in Madrid in the Real Academia de la Historia and was only discovered in the 1950s by Spanish historian Alonso Damaso. Here, take a look. What we see here is the front side of the folio 245. On the back side starts the Chronicon Albedense, a universal history of Spain, but especially focused on the Kingdom of Asturia from the 8th century to the late 9th century. The column of the left are the last lines of a treatise by Saint Eucherius. On the bottom, we see a short note on the history of Cantabria, a region in the north of Spain. On the right is the aforementioned Nota Emilianense. It is written in a Visigoth script and by the same hand as the short historical note on the bottom. It is dated between 1065 and 1075, so about a generation earlier as the Song of Roland is traditionally dated. I don't want to get too much into the whole issue of dating, because I think it's very problematic, especially for the chansons de geste, which are a product of constant retellings. But, and this is the important part, the discovery leaves no doubt that there was a legend of Roncevaux already before the Song of Roland. And the song therefore can't be the product of the imagination of a single poet writing by candlelight in some French monastery. But how did this early legend look like? Well, when we take a look at the cast of characters in the Nota Emilianense, we find a lot of familiar faces. It mentions Roland, Olivier, Auger, and Archbishop Tulpen. The last two I haven't mentioned before, but they're also important parts of the story. But where is the traitor Ganelon? And what is William and his nephew Bertrand doing among Charlemagne's followers? William is the hero of his own epic cycle, fighting for Charlemagne's incapable son Louis and not for the white-bearded king himself. And it gets even more confusing when we go further back in time. Studies of the names of brothers have shown that at least since the 1030s, Olivier is known in connection with Roland. In other words, parents named their sons Olivier and Roland in reference to the legend. But the interesting thing is that in the majority of cases, the firstborn son is called Olivier. And with the story as we know it in the Song of Roland, it makes little sense to call the firstborn son Olivier. So it seems like their roles have switched over time. Interesting is also that the 6 names mentioned in the Nota are all part of the chanson about Charlemagne's pilgrimage to Jerusalem. We don't really know what that means. Historians have suggested that pilgrimage is one of the oldest songs and therefore contains an earlier constellation of heroes. Anyway, what can we say about the development of the legend? Well, an ambush conducted by Christian Basques was transformed into a Saracen attack, which, considering what we know about social memory, makes perfect sense. After all, it's the time of the Crusades. William seems to have been part of the earlier legend, but was later removed and he got his own cycle. And it also seems like the whole plot of Ganelon's treason is also a later tradition, maybe to explain why the vanguard is ambushed in the first place. But of course, this is only speculation. After all, the monk making the little scrambles in the Emilian Codex could just as well have written down a different, maybe Northern Spanish version of the legend, Northern Spanish tradition of the legend. As we know, different versions of the past can and in fact did exist side by side. Except for the Cid, none of the Spanish epics survive. And if we believe historians like Ramon Mendes Pidal, the Spanish tradition must have been at least as plentiful as the French. I want to end this little talk on a somewhat different note. And if you take away only one thing from my little story, let it be this. Memory changes over time. And even though the Song of Roland is undoubtedly had its predecessors, as the Nota Emilianense shows, it is first and foremost a product of its own society and time. And admittedly, it seems very attractive to look for some kind of hidden truth about the 8th century that was conserved only in popular knowledge. However, in doing so, we're making the same mistakes as the contemporaries themselves. We confuse memory with history. That's the end of the story. I hope you enjoyed what I had to say about the Song of Roland in the Nota Emilianense, and have a good night.